Bullying occurs when teenagers get together, whether that's in person or in social media. Obviously, the same at work.
And it's always happened.
And it's always happened. So we can't blame social media for cyberbullying. That would be like blaming schools for bullying or blaming, every time people get together for bullying. This is a normal fact of teenagers' lives.
So therefore, why are they more unhappy, anxious and dissatisfied now than before, if they are?
Well, I think our studies show the answers don't lie in social media necessarily. There's been a lot of talk about social media ruining a generation, etc., etc. Our data don't show that. Our data show that social media in and of itself doesn't have an effect on your mental health and well-being if you're a girl.
But it does show that they are more unhappy and anxious and all the rest of it. So what is causing that? Is it because they're spending so much time on social media and they're not getting enough sleep, or
Yeah,
what?
well, that's part of it. The things we know make young people happy are getting enough physical exercise, it's getting enough sleep, and the ordinary day-to-day social interaction, and also not being bullied. So if we get those right, I think our message is parents should worry less about the time that teenagers are spending accessing social media and worry about what they're accessing. The content's important, whether it's cyberbullying or harmful sites, whether they're getting enough sleep, and whether they're getting enough physical activity, and the things that parents have always known that make teenagers happy.
Professor Viner, thanks very much indeed.
It's coming up. It's in about 8 minutes to 7 now. In just 2 weeks' time, tens of thousands of workers could face six-figure tax bills, which many will struggle to pay. They've been told by the taxman, HMRC, that if they don't agree repayment terms by the end of August, they'll face what are called loan charges to recoup underpaid tax from freelancers and agency workers who were paid via loans they were told never needed to be repaid. Well, many MPs are unhappy about this and say the charges are unfair. Here to explain it all is our economics correspondent, Andy Verity. Why is the HMRC introducing these charges?
Well, morning, Nick. HMRC says that from 1999 until recently, around 50,000 people joined schemes which it calls disguised remuneration, where typically an employment agency diverts their pay to an offshore trust, and the trust pays them in loans, taxed at 1% to 2% or less, which, as you say, don't need repaying. Now, in 2016, George Osborne introduced the loan charge to reclaim tax that Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs says has been avoided on those loans. And last year, those affected got letters saying they had to add up all the income from the loans, going back to 1999, and make an offer to pay tax on them. They have to get HMRC's agreement by the end of August, otherwise the loan charge would need to be paid in January at tax rates of up to 45%. That's often a six-figure sum, Nick, far in excess of people's incomes.
And 260 MPs, more I think, in fact, have raised concerns about this, and they're particularly concerned about the timing of the bill.
Yeah, that's right, because normally the taxman has to open an inquiry into your taxes within 4 years, and tax barristers say these loan charges are different because they can be applied to income dating back 20 years, which can mean huge repayments which can't be challenged at a tax tribunal. MPs have criticised the letters being sent to people asking them to settle their bills. It tells them they've been involved in tax avoidance and encourages people to settle their taxes and reminds them it's the law. But more than 150 MPs on an all-party group say it's too heavy-handed. Many people aren't at all wealthy, some nurses, social workers, and it's putting people under too much pressure. I've been speaking to Gail, whose father had one of the letters and became convinced he would either go to prison or lose his home. Now, he took his own life last year and mentioned the loan charge in the letter he left. This is what Gail told me.
He was the loveliest gentleman you would ever meet. Caring, selfless. He worked so hard, and he was honest. And he took his life because of the impact the loan charge had on him. He couldn't deal with the shame, the stigma. He thought he was a criminal.
Can you help people understand why people might get to such a dark place as a result of what is essentially a tax bill?
For Dad, it was the waiting, the not knowing the outcome, if it would ever end. It was a shame.
Why did he feel shame?
Because to him, he'd broken the law. In letters, it says it's the law. He truly believed that he was a criminal. He spoke about going to prison. It wasn't the fact that he would have to go to prison and go through that. It was the effect it would have on us and the shame and the stigma. He believed he was a criminal, and he wasn't. The impact the loan charges had on my father's mental health, I just don't think he could see any light at the end of the tunnel at all.
How do you know that it was the loan charge that contributed?
He wrote a very long letter and said, "I'm currently involved in a settlement scheme for income tax avoidance known as contractor loan settlements. I'm so sorry, but I just can't take it anymore. Sorry. He didn't need to feel ashamed or like a criminal or that there was no way out. There was a way out. It's so real. We are reading the words of my dad, and he was indestructible. He really was. If someone would just listen and make a change, halt it, just don't remain silent."
That was Gail talking to our economics correspondent Andy Verity. Now, if you're concerned about the issue, you could go to the BBC Action Line, and the HMRC have told the BBC that their sympathies are with the family and friends of people like Gail, and their message to anyone concerned about a tax bill is please come and talk to us and we will help. They have a special disguised remuneration helpline with specialists who can help.
It is now time for the weather forecast, Darren.
Yes, we've got some rain around today. We'll start with the details across southern England and Wales, where rain is spreading to all areas this morning. Could be quite heavy for a while at first across South Wales. But during the afternoon, I think the rain in these areas should become lighter and patchy. It'll be quite breezy, though, especially around some English Channel coast. Moving northwards into the Midlands and eastern England, and once the rain arrives here this morning, it will continue on and off all day. Could be quite heavy and thundery rain during this afternoon. For northern England, something a little bit drier. The rain that's pushing in this morning is quite light and patchy, and through the afternoon many areas, especially further north, will be dry. Temperatures though struggling to 17 or 18 across much of England and Wales, maybe 19 or 20 for East Wales and the West Country. For Northern Ireland, a cloudy day, some rain early and then returning later on in the day, temperatures of 17 or 18 degrees. And for Scotland today, we've got rain pushing northwards and eastwards, not amounting to very much. There may be some sunshine in Aberdeenshire and particularly the Northern Isles before it turns wetter again in the northwest later on in the day. Before then, temperatures no better than 15 or 16 Celsius.
Thank you, Darren. Next week, Radio 4 presents the Second World War from a different viewpoint.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room, 10 Downing Street.
The Second World War was fought not just between entire nations, but entire economies.
Germany, Italy and Japan had ranged themselves against an alliance of much richer countries.
Victory was determined not just by what happened on the battlefield, but by how well countries could mobilise their industry, how they marshalled their resources, and how they fed or didn't their populations.
It's a small-scale, very traditional agriculture which doesn't even adequately match the demands of the city population.
World War II, the economic battle, with me, Duncan Weldon. Next Monday to Friday afternoon at 1:45 on BBC Radio 4.
Coming up, the chief executive of the National Grid gives his first interview since the power cuts last weekend, and why an advert showing new fathers not making a very good job of looking after their babies has been banned.
You're listening to Today with John Humphreys and Nick Robinson. Good morning, it's 7 o'clock on Wednesday the 14th of August. The headlines this morning: the former Chancellor Philip Hammond has accused Boris Johnson of trying to wreck any chance of a new Brexit deal by making demands the EU will never accept. Hong Kong Airport has secured a court injunction to limit further disruption after 2 days of clashes between police and pro-democracy protesters. Rail passengers are bracing themselves for another big fare rise. The BBC News is read this morning by Jane Steele.
The former Chancellor Philip Hammond has launched an attack on Boris Johnson's approach to Brexit, saying he is deliberately wrecking any hope of a deal with the EU. Mr Hammond resigned when Mr Johnson was elected as Conservative leader because of the new Prime Minister's willingness to leave without an agreement. In an article in The Times, Mr Hammond said a no-deal Brexit would be a betrayal of the 2016 referendum result, and And he's also joined other former ministers in writing to Mr Johnson to say they're alarmed by his apparent unwillingness to compromise. Here's our political correspondent, Tom Barton.
In the 3 weeks since Philip Hammond stood down as Chancellor, he's kept his counsel. But today, he's come out fighting, describing Boris Johnson's negotiating stance as a wrecking one. He says it's a travesty of the truth to pretend that Leave voters backed a no-deal Brexit in the 2016 referendum. He also takes apparent aim at the Prime Minister's closest advisor, the former Vote Leave director Dominic Cummings, writing that the unelected people who pull the strings of this government know the EU cannot and will not renegotiate the Brexit deal agreed by Theresa May. The former Chancellor also suggests that he might vote against the government, saying Parliament will make its voice heard and that a no-deal Brexit must not happen. If it did, he argues that rather than resulting in a powerful, independent United Kingdom, the reality would be a diminished and inward-looking Little England. A government source said that as Chancellor, Mr Hammond did everything he could to block preparations for leaving and had undermined negotiations, and that Britain would be leaving at the end of October, despite his best efforts to the contrary.
The Commons Speaker, John Bercow, has reportedly said he would fight with every bone in his body to stop the government closing down Parliament to force through a no-deal Brexit. The Daily Telegraph says he told an audience at the Edinburgh Fringe that such a move would be anathema to him, and he said MPs could still stop the UK leaving the EU without a deal. Downing Street said his comments were hypothetical. China has condemned the anti-government protests which have disrupted Hong Kong's airport over the past 2 days. Flights are resuming and the airport authorities have obtained a court order to prevent demonstrators from repeating their occupation of the terminal building. China's Hong Kong Affairs Office has issued a statement saying the protesters' actions were terrorist-like and offering support for the city's government. One of the protesters, Michael Moe, accused the airport's operators of dirty tricks against the activists.
They keep on announcing to the public that the service has been disrupted, but we all know that most of the flights are indeed operational yesterday. It is their decisions to spoof the passengers, and I think it's a pretty nasty way to try to demonize the protesters here.
A post-mortem examination is taking place in Malaysia to try to establish how a London teenager died during a family holiday. The naked body of Nora Quarren, who was 15 and from London, was found yesterday 10 days after she went missing from a jungle resort. From there, Howard Johnson sent this report.
A senior pathologist arrived at the hospital in Seremban early this morning to begin a post-mortem examination of Nora's body. She was found by a group of volunteer hikers around a mile away from the Dusun resort from where she went missing. According to police, her unclothed body was found beside a stream in a hilly area of a palm oil plantation. The area had previously been scoured by Malaysian search and rescue workers. The teenager, who lived with her parents in London, had been missing for 10 days. The family have always insisted, given Nora's learning difficulties, it is very unlikely she would have walked off alone. The Malaysian police have always treated Nora's disappearance as a missing persons case.
The MP Chris Williamson is suing Labour for reimposing his suspension for comments he made about the party's handling of complaints about anti-Semitism. He said the decision was unconstitutional. Here's Andy Moore.
Mr Williamson was originally suspended in February after being filmed saying that Labour had given too much ground and was being demonised over anti-Semitism complaints. He later said he deeply regretted the remarks. In July, a panel of Labour's National Executive Committee ruled that his suspension should be lifted following a formal warning. That suspension was then reimposed 2 days later after a backlash from Jewish groups. Mr Williamson has now lodged papers with the High Court and says he's hoping to overturn what he called the unconstitutional decision to reinstate his suspension.
Rail passengers will find out today by how much regulated fares will increase next year. The government caps the annual rise based on inflation in July as measured by the Retail Prices Index. Estimates have suggested RPI will be 2.8% higher, which would mean an increase of around £100 for many commuters. Passenger groups have called for the calculation to be based on CPI inflation, which is generally lower. Ministers have also announced that a new rail card for 16 to 17-year-olds will be launched next week. Here's our business correspondent, Emma Simpson.
It's called the 16 to 17 Saver. From next Tuesday, this age group can buy the new rail card for £30, entitling them to a 50% discount on standard class journeys across England, Wales and into Scotland. It's valid for peak times and will also reduce the price of season tickets. The aim is to help students travelling to school, work or college. The government reckons it'll save young people and their families an average of £186 every year.
Labour has outlined proposals that would prevent universities from offering places based on predicted grades. It says the current system is deeply unfair and that students should be allowed to apply only when they've had their exam results. But universities have expressed reservations about the plans. The details from our education correspondent Frankie McCamley.
The proposals come as students across England, Wales and Northern Ireland prepare to receive their A-level and BTEC results this week. Labour says radical change is needed for university admissions, claiming disadvantaged students are losing out because of inaccurate predictions. It follows research by the Department for Business, Innovation and Skills in 2011 that found just over 40% of grades had been over-predicted. But universities and schools say any changes would be complex and could mean an overhaul of the school calendar. Some unions have warned a new application process held in the few weeks between results day and the start of term would be extremely difficult to manage, leaving only a short window for students to find financial support and accommodation at their chosen university.
The government is being urged to abandon efforts to get money from thousands of freelancers and contractors who it says owe unpaid tax going back 20 years. More than 200 MPs have warned that a proposed loan charge to recover the money could bankrupt people and force others to sell their homes. Our correspondent Andy Verity has more details.
By the end of August, more than 50,000 contractors and agency workers have to add up all loans from trusts they have had going back to 1999 and agree a voluntary sum to settle tax that Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs says has been avoided. If they don't, HMRC has warned